Nobody went looking for the Svensson children because the whole town believed they were dead. Their aunt told everyone they had gone to Denver to find work. The lie served its purpose because the truth would not have served it. The truth was that Meredith Hawthorne had put two children out on a September morning with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and the people of Copper Falls accepted the lie because it was convenient and because the alternative required them to do something, and doing something about other people's cruelty is a cost that most communities prefer not to pay. 4 years later, smoke rose from a mountain that everyone knew had been abandoned since 1876. And Marcus Dalloway, who had lived in that valley for 30 years and who had walked past that mountain 1,000 times, stood at the edge of his property and watched the thin gray wisp curl up from a crack in the rock face. And for the first time in his life, he could not explain what he was seeing. But that comes later. First, there was a morning in September of 1886, and two children standing in the dirt road outside a house that had been their home for 2 years, and a woman in the doorway who would not look at them, and a man behind her who was already closing the door. Torvald Svensson was 18 years old. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, with shoulders that had broadened from 2 years of splitting wood and hauling water and doing every task that Silas Hawthorne had demanded of him. His hair was dark brown, almost black in certain light, and his eyes were gray, the color of winter sky before snow. He had his father's hands, large and square, and already calloused in the places where a working man's hands callous first. His sister Britta was 13. She was tall for her age, with the same gray eyes and the same straight posture, and she held a small leather journal against her chest the way a younger child might hold a doll. The journal had been their mother's. It contained recipes and remedies and pressed flowers and notes in handwriting that Britta had memorized because the handwriting was all she had left. Their parents had died of typhoid fever 2 years earlier, in the summer of 1884. Their father, Eric Svensson, had been a mine foreman, a Norwegian immigrant who had come to Colorado in 1872 and who had spent 12 years working the copper and silver mines of the high country. Their mother, Ingrid, had been a healer in the old tradition, a woman who knew which roots cured fever and which bark stopped bleeding and which tea could help a woman sleep when grief would not let her. They had died within 3 days of each other, Eric first and then Ingrid, and the children had buried them in the cemetery on the hill above Copper Falls, in plots that faced east toward the mountains their father had loved. And then Meredith Hawthorne had come. She was Ingrid's older sister, a widow who had remarried 6 months earlier to a man named Silas Hawthorne, who owned the general store in town and who had a reputation for driving hard bargains and holding grudges longer than was healthy. Meredith had taken the children in, she said, because they were family. What she did not say was that she had taken them in because the alternative, letting them go to the county orphanage, would have made her look heartless in front of the town. For 2 years, Torvald and Britta had lived in the small room at the back of the Hawthorne house. They had worked from dawn until dark. They had eaten after Meredith and Silas had finished their meals. They had worn clothes that Meredith considered too worn for charity, but good enough for children who should be grateful they had a roof at all. Torvald had split wood and hauled water and mucked stables and mended fences. Britta had cooked and cleaned and scrubbed floors and done laundry and sewn and mended and done every task that Meredith assigned her, and some that Silas assigned her too. And then 3 days before the September morning, Silas had come to Britta in the kitchen. He had told her that from now on she would cook his meals separately from Meredith's. She would serve him at his own table in the study. She would wash his clothes and iron his shirts and bring him his coffee in the morning and his whiskey at night. She would be his personal servant, available whenever he called. Britta had looked at him and said, in a voice that did not waver, "I am not your servant." Silas had stopped smiling. That night he had told Meredith that the girl was ungrateful and willful and needed to be taught her place. He had demanded that Britta be punished, that she be made to understand who was in charge. When Torvald found out what Silas had demanded of his sister, he had walked into the study where Silas was reading his newspaper. "My sister will not serve you," Torvald said quietly. "She will not cook for you separately. She will not bring you anything. She is not your servant. She is a child, and she is my responsibility, and you will leave her alone." Silas had stood up, his face red, his hands clenched into fists. And Torvald, who was 18 and who had spent 2 years doing the work of a grown man, had not stepped back. "Is that clear?" he had asked. Silas had swung at him. Torvald had caught his wrist, twisted, and put him on the floor without throwing a single punch. Then he had walked out of the study and closed the door behind him. The next morning, Meredith had woken them before dawn. "Get out," she had said. "Both of you. Now." She had not let them pack. She had not let them take food or blankets or money. She had not let Britta take the coat that had been their mother's because Meredith had already claimed it as her own. She had stood in the doorway and watched them walk down the dirt road toward town, and she had not said goodbye, and she had not said she was sorry, and she had not said anything at all except when they were almost out of earshot, "If you come back, Silas will have you arrested for assault." And that was how Torvald and Britta Svensson found themselves standing on the edge of Copper Falls on a September morning in 1886, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a leather journal pressed against a 13-year-old girl's chest. Torvald looked at the town, the general store where Silas would be opening for business in an hour, the church where Father Walsh would be preparing for morning mass, the houses where families were waking up and starting their days and not knowing or caring that 2 children had just been thrown away like yesterday's garbage. Then he looked at the mountain. Ironback Mountain rose to the north, its south face catching the first light of the sun. Somewhere up there, hidden in the trees and the rocks, was the old consolidated copper mine that his father had worked before the company pulled out. "Come on," he said to Britta. "Where are we going?" "Up." The road to the old mine had been abandoned for 10 years, but it was still passable if you knew where to look and did not mind stepping over fallen trees and pushing through brush that had grown thick in the absence of wagon traffic. Torvald knew where to look. His father had worked that mine for 3 years before it closed, and on summer Sundays, Eric had sometimes taken his son up the mountain to show him the tunnels and the equipment and the way the copper ore sparkled green and blue in the lantern light. "This is where I learned my trade," Eric had told him once, standing in the mouth of the lowest drift tunnel. "And someday, when you are older, I will teach you everything I know." Eric had died before someday came, but Torvald remembered. He remembered the tunnels and the stopes and the way his father had explained how the mountain held its temperature constant, 54 degrees winter and summer, because the massive rock insulated against the changes of the world outside. He remembered his father saying, "In Norway, my grandfather lived in a mountain every winter, not in a house on a mountain, in the mountain itself. The old people knew that rock holds heat better than wood, and that a cave with a fire is warmer than a cabin with a stove." He remembered his father's hands teaching him to read the grain of timber, to test the soundness of a beam, to build structures that would hold against weight and time and the slow patience of gravity. And he remembered his father saying, one afternoon when they were sitting at the entrance of the drift tunnel, watching the sun set over the valley, "If you ever have nowhere else to go, remember this place. The company abandoned it because the vertical shaft flooded. But the horizontal tunnels are still sound. And a sound tunnel is a roof, and a roof is the beginning of a home." Torvald had been 12 years old when his father said that. He had not understood why anyone would ever have nowhere else to go. He understood now. The walk up the mountain took 4 hours. The road climbed steadily, switching back and forth across the south face, gaining 2,000 feet of elevation in 5 miles. Britta stumbled twice in the first hour, her legs weak from exhaustion and her lungs burning in the thin mountain air. Torvald slowed his pace. He did not carry her because she would not have allowed it. But he walked beside her, and when she stumbled, he steadied her. And when she stopped to catch her breath, he stopped with her. Halfway up the mountain, a dog appeared. It came out of the brush beside the road, thin and dirty and limping on its front left leg. It was a shepherd mix, brown and tan with a darker saddle across its back, and it stood in the middle of the road and looked at them with eyes that expected to be kicked. Britta knelt down. "Don't," Torvald said. "We don't have food. We can't take care of it." "He doesn't have anyone either," Britta said. She held out her hand. The dog flinched. Then it took a tentative step forward and another, and then it was close enough for Britta to touch its head, and when she did, it pressed its whole body against her legs and closed its eyes. "His leg is hurt," Britta said. "Someone beat him. You can see the marks." "Britta, we're not leaving him." Torvald looked at the dog. The dog looked at Torvald. There was something in its eyes that Torvald recognized, something that looked like the decision to trust one more time, even though every previous trust had been betrayed. Fine, Torvald said, but if he can't keep up, he stays behind. The dog kept up. It limped beside Britta for the rest of the climb, and when they reached the mine site in the late afternoon, it sat down at the entrance to the lowest drift tunnel and looked at them as if to say, well, this is home now. What should we call him? Britta asked. Torvald looked at the green and blue oxidation on the rocks around the tunnel entrance, the same copper ore that his father had spent 3 years pulling out of this mountain. Copper, he said. The mine site was exactly as Torvald remembered it, except that 10 years of abandonment had accelerated the decay. The head frame over the flooded vertical shaft had collapsed, its timbers gray and splintered. The crushing mill had lost its roof entirely, and saplings were growing up through the floor where the stamps had once thundered. The powder magazine was still standing, its thick stone walls intact, but the door had rotted off its hinges. The tool shed was a pile of rubble. The assay office was missing half its wall, but the fire brick crucible furnace inside was still intact, too heavy for anyone to have bothered moving. And the 3 drift tunnels that cut horizontally into the south face of the mountain were still there, their entrances dark and silent, their timbers gray with age but still standing. Torvald walked to the lowest tunnel, the one his father had shown him. He stood at the entrance and looked into the darkness and felt the cool air flowing out, constant and unchanging, 54 degrees even though the September afternoon was warm. Wait here, he said to Britta. He did not have a lantern, so he walked with his hands on the walls, feeling the rough surface of the timber and the smoother surface of the rock behind it. The tunnel was 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, and the floor was littered with debris, loose rock, and broken timber, and the remains of tools left behind when the company pulled out. At 80 feet, the tunnel intersected a crosscut that ran left and right along the vein. Torvald turned right, toward the south, and walked another 40 feet until the crosscut opened into a larger space. A stope, a mined-out chamber where the ore had been extracted. He could not see it in the darkness, but he remembered it from his father's tours. 20 feet wide, 15 feet deep, 12 feet tall. The ceiling was solid, a pillar of unmined rock that the company had left to hold up the mountain. The floor at one end had been backfilled with waste rock, creating a raised platform that was flat and dry. Torvald walked back to the entrance. It's sound, he said to Britta. The tunnel, the timbers, everything. We can live here. Britta looked at the dark mouth of the tunnel. She looked at the ruined buildings around them. She looked at the dog sitting at her feet, looking up at her with eyes that had already decided to trust. Okay, she said. She opened her mother's journal and wrote the first entry of their new life. Day 1. We are here. The tunnel is dry. Torvald says we can live here. If you want to know what happened when 2 orphan children walked into an abandoned copper mine and did not come out for 4 years, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. Because what comes next is how 2 children who had nothing built something that would save 17 lives and bring 1 new life into the world. Now let us continue. The first month was survival. They had no tools except what they could salvage from the abandoned buildings. They had no food except what they could find on the mountain. They had no blankets, no cooking pots, no light sources except the matches Britta had found in the pocket of her dress. A half-empty box that she had been carrying for months because her mother had always told her that fire was the difference between life and death in the mountains. Torvald worked from dawn until dark. He pulled usable timber from the collapsed buildings and dragged it to the tunnel entrance. He gathered flat stones from the creek bed a quarter-mile below the mine and carried them up in loads of 6 and 8, building a fire pit at the mouth of the tunnel where the smoke could escape into the open air. He sealed the tunnel entrance with waste rock and salvaged timber, narrowing it from 6 feet to 3 feet, building a frame that could hold a door. The narrowing served 2 purposes. It reduced the opening that wind could blow through, and it made the entrance look like a natural collapse, a closed tunnel that anyone walking the old mine road would pass without a second glance. Torvald did not want to be found. Britta gathered food. She walked the mountainside with Copper beside her, collecting what she recognized from her mother's journal. Wild onions and dandelion greens, chokecherries and service berries and rose hips. The roots of biscuit root and yampa that grew in the meadows above the mine. She brought everything back to the tunnel entrance and spread it out on flat stones and tried to remember what her mother had taught her about drying and storing and preserving. She set snares for rabbits using wire that Torvald had found in the tool shed. She caught two in the first week. She skinned them with a piece of broken glass and cooked them over the fire pit and saved the bones for broth. At night, they slept in the stope, on a bed of pine boughs that Torvald had gathered from the forest below the mine. The temperature inside the mountain was constant, 54 degrees, warmer than the nights outside, but cold enough that they slept pressed together for warmth, with copper between them, his body heat adding to theirs. Torvald discovered the heating system by accident. He had built a fire at the tunnel entrance to cook their dinner, and when the fire burned down, he had carried one of the hot stones from the fire pit into the stope, thinking that it might provide a few minutes of warmth while they ate. But the stone did not cool as quickly as he expected. In the constant 54-degree air of the stope, the hot stone radiated heat for hours, warming the space around it like a small furnace. The next night, he carried in 3 stones. The night after that, 4. By the end of the first week, he had built a system. He heated stones in the fire pit at the tunnel entrance, carried them into the stope in a canvas sling made from a piece of salvaged tent, and arranged them in a circle around the sleeping platform. The stones held heat for 6 to 8 hours, long enough to keep the stope warm through the night. "Father told me about this," Torvald said to Britta one night, as they lay on the pine boughs with copper between them and the hot stones glowing faintly in the darkness around them. "Grandfather learned it in Norway. The old miners heated their underground chambers this way." Britta wrote it down in her mother's journal, adding to the knowledge that had been passed from mother to daughter. Day 7. We have food for 2 weeks. Torvald built a door. Day 14. First frost on the mountain. Inside, nothing changed. Day 21. Torvald found a natural vent in the back of the stope. Smoke rises through a crack in the rock and exits somewhere on the mountainside above us. We can have fire inside now. Day 28. We are alive. On the 29th day, Britta was exploring the crosscut that led in the opposite direction from their stope when she found the second chamber. It was smaller than the first, 10 feet by 12 feet with a lower ceiling, but it had a dry floor and something the first stope did not have: a crack in the wall that admitted daylight. The crack was narrow, barely an inch wide, and the light that came through was thin and gray. But it moved. As the sun crossed the sky outside, the line of light moved across the chamber floor, marking the hours like the hand of a clock. Britta called Torvald. He stood in the chamber and watched the light and then looked at the crack. "I can widen it," he said. "Not much. Not enough to see from outside, but enough to let in more light." He worked on it for 3 days using a salvaged mining pick to chip away at the rock around the crack, widening it from 1 inch to 2 inches. When he was done, the light that came through was bright enough to read by. "A sundial," Britta said. "A calendar. A reminder that the world outside still exists." She claimed the second stope as her workspace. She hung bundles of dried herbs from the ceiling and arranged her stores of food along the walls and set up a flat stone as a writing desk where the light fell during the afternoon hours. Torvald ran twine between the 2 stopes and hung canvas curtains at each end, creating connected rooms that could be closed off individually. Each chamber heated only its own volume. The curtains trapped warm air the way doors trap it in a house. They were building a home, and that was when Britta found the copper. She was running her hands along the wall of her stope, feeling the rough surface of the rock when her fingers touched something different, smooth, cool in a different way than the surrounding stone. She leaned close and saw, in the thin daylight from the crack, a vein of green and blue that sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars. She called Torvald. He came with a piece of burning pine branch and held it up to the wall. The vein was 3 inches wide and ran diagonally across the wall from floor to ceiling. It was pure copper ore, malachite and azurite, green and blue mixed together in patterns that looked like frozen fire. "They missed it," Torvald said quietly. "The company. They were looking for the big veins, the ones worth extracting by the ton. They did not see this." "What can we do with it?" Britta asked. "I do not know yet, but I will find out." The first winter came on the 14th of November with a snowstorm that dropped 2 feet on the upper slopes and buried the mine road under drifts that would not melt until April. The world outside turned white and silent and hostile. Temperatures dropped below zero on the worst nights. Wind drove snow horizontally through the timber. The creek froze at the edges and slowed to a trickle in the center. Inside the mountain, Torvald and Britta noticed the winter the way a fish notices weather, as a fact about a different world. 54 degrees in November, 54 degrees in December, 54 degrees in January and February and March. The hot stones and the canvas curtains and the thousands of tons of rock surrounding them kept the stopes livable through winter without the 40 pounds of firewood per day that the houses in Copper Falls were burning. Torvald burned 8 pounds. The mountain did the rest. But on the 23rd day of December, Britta collapsed. She had been gathering snow to melt for water, walking the short distance from the tunnel entrance to a drift that had accumulated clean snow, when her legs gave out and she fell and could not get up. Torvald heard Copper barking. He ran outside and found his sister lying in the snow, her face flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and rapid. He carried her inside. For 3 days she burned. Her forehead was hot to the touch. Her cough rattled in her chest. She could not keep food down, and the water Torvald gave her seemed to pass through her body without providing any benefit. On the 4th day, she coughed up blood. Torvald sat beside her on the sleeping platform and held her hand and listened to her breathing and knew that she was dying. He knew what she had: pneumonia, the same disease that had killed dozens of miners in Copper Falls over the years. He knew what she needed: medicine, quinine or something to bring down the fever and fight the infection. He knew where to get it: the pharmacy in Copper Falls, 2 miles down the mountain and across the valley. He knew what would happen if he went. If anyone saw him, if anyone recognized him, Silas Hawthorne would have him arrested, and Britta would die alone in a hole in the mountain with no one but a dog to watch over her. He went anyway. He left at midnight, when the snow had stopped and the moon was bright enough to see by. He walked down the mountain in the dark, following the road by memory, his feet crunching through the crust of ice that had formed on top of the snow. He reached Copper Falls at 2 in the morning, when every window was dark and every door was locked. The pharmacy was on the main street, 3 doors down from Silas Hawthorne's general store. Torvald circled around to the back. He found a window that had been left unlatched. He climbed through. Inside, he moved by touch, running his hands along shelves until he found bottles, reading labels by the moonlight that came through the front window. He found quinine. He found laudanum. He found a tin of salve that the label said was for chest congestion. He put everything in his coat pockets. And then he found the cash box. It was on the counter beside the scale, unlocked because no one in Copper Falls locked anything at night. Torvald looked at it for a long moment. He thought about everything Silas had taken from him and his sister. He thought about the 2 years of labor that had gone unpaid. He left the cash box untouched. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a chunk of raw copper ore, the size of a small apple, that he had chipped from the wall of Britta's stove 2 days before. He set it on the counter beside the cash box. Then he climbed back out the window and walked 2 miles through the snow back to the mountain and reached the tunnel entrance as the first gray light of dawn was showing on the eastern horizon. Britta was still alive. He gave her the quinine. He gave her the laudanum for the pain. He rubbed the salve on her chest and covered her with every blanket and canvas they had. And then he sat beside her and held her hand and waited. She did not die. On the 3rd day after he returned, her fever broke. On the 5th day, she sat up on her own. On the 7th day, she walked from the sleeping platform to the entrance of the stope. "You went down there," she said. "You went to town." "Yes." "You could have been caught. You could have died in the snow." "Yes." "Why?" Torvald looked at his sister. She was thinner than she had been a week ago, her cheeks hollow, her eyes too large in her narrow face. But she was alive. "You know why," he said. Britta reached out and took his hand. "You went down to hell to bring me medicine," she said. "I will not forget that, ever." This is a good moment to pause. If this story is touching your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Torvald's place? Now back to the story. Spring came slowly to Ironback Mountain, the snow retreating down the slopes in stages. revealing the brown grass and bare rock beneath. The creek swelled with meltwater. Birds returned to the timber. And Torvald Svensson, who had spent the winter keeping his sister alive and himself sane, walked out of the tunnel one morning in late March and looked at the world and decided it was time to build something that would last. He had learned enough in the first winter to know what they needed: more storage space, better ventilation, a way to cook inside the mountain without filling the stopes with smoke, a door that would keep out the cold and the wind and any curious animals that might wander up the old mine road. But he had also learned something else, something he had not expected. The vein of copper in Britta's stope was not just beautiful, it was useful. Native copper, pure metal that had formed in the rock over millions of years. It could be worked directly, hammered into shape without the need for a forge, shaped into tools and objects that could be traded for the things they could not make themselves. Torvald had made his first copper object in January, during the long nights when Britta was recovering. He had chipped a piece of native copper from the wall, the size of his thumb, and he had hammered it on a flat stone until it was thin and round. And then he had bent it and shaped it until it was a hook. A simple hook, nothing remarkable, but it held weight and it did not rust. And when Torvald hung it on the wall of the stope and stepped back to look at it, he felt something that he had not felt in a long time: pride. By the end of March, he had made a dozen hooks and hinges and rivets and a ladle and a second pot and buttons, copper buttons that gleamed in the firelight, and a bracelet. He made the bracelet for Britta, hammering a strip of copper into a curve that fit around her wrist, polishing it with sand until it shone. She wore it every day after that, turning it on her wrist when she was thinking, touching it when she was worried. "Why did you make this?" she asked him once. "Because we are not just surviving," he said. "We are living, and living means making beautiful things, even in a hole in the mountain." But copper buttons and bracelets were not enough to sustain them. They needed food they could not grow or hunt. They needed cloth and tools and medicine. They needed things that only trade could provide. And so Torvald began to trade. The first trade was an accident. He had walked down the mountain in April to scout the road, and he had encountered a man on horseback, a rancher named Gunnar Lindqvist, who owned a spread 5 miles to the south. Lindqvist was Swedish, a big man with a blond beard and blue eyes, and a way of looking at people that suggested he was measuring them for something. He looked at Torvald for a long moment, at his worn clothes and his calloused hands and the copper buttons on his coat. "Where did you get those?" he asked, pointing at the buttons. "I made them." "From what?" "Copper. From the old mine." Lindqvist dismounted. He walked closer and examined the buttons. He ran his thumb over the surface, feeling the smooth metal, the slight irregularities that showed they had been hammered by hand. "These are good," he said. "Better than the brass ones I buy from the store." "How much?" They traded, buttons for salt and flour and a wool blanket. Lindqvist did not ask where Torvald lived or how he had come to be on the mountain. He simply made the trade and mounted his horse and rode away. But he came back. 2 weeks later, he appeared at the mine entrance with a pack mule loaded with supplies. He had brought seed potatoes and bean seeds and onion sets. He had brought more flour and coffee and dried apples. He had brought news. "People in town are talking about you," he said. "They say 2 children disappeared last fall, but some people are not so sure they went to Denver." Torvald said nothing. "I am not going to tell anyone where you are," Lindqvist said. "I recognize the work." He pointed at the timbers that framed the narrowed entrance. "My grandfather built like this, in the old country. Scandinavian work." "Your father was Norwegian?" "Yes." "Then you learned well." He turned and mounted his horse. "I will come back in 2 weeks, bring more buttons, and if you can make hinges, bring those too." That was how the trading began. Every 2 weeks, Lindqvist came to the mine with supplies. Every 2 weeks, Torvald had copper goods ready to trade. The exchange was simple and silent. 2 men who understood that some questions should not be asked. In February of 1889, almost 3 years after they had walked into the mine, a man named Ezra Boone was panning for placer gold in the creek below Ironback Mountain. Ezra was 58 years old, thin as a rail, with a white beard and blue eyes that had been looking at rocks for 40 years. He had come to Colorado in 1861 during the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, and he had spent the decades since moving from stream to stream and mountain to mountain, never finding the big strike, but always finding enough to keep himself alive. He knew the mountains the way some men know their own homes. And on a cold morning in February, standing in the creek with ice forming on his beard, he looked up at Ironback Mountain and saw something that should not have been there. Smoke. A thin wisp rising from a crack in the mountainside above the lowest drift tunnel. Smoke in a closed mine meant either a coal seam burning or a person, and coal seams did not burn in copper mines. Ezra climbed the mountain. He found the drift entrance, saw the door that should not have been there, and knocked. Torvald opened it. Ezra looked at him, at the door, at the timbers framing the entrance. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I knew your father." Torvald's face changed. The caution did not disappear, but something else appeared alongside it. Recognition. "He mentioned you," Torvald said. "He said you taught him to read rock." "I did, 30 years ago in the San Juans, before he met your mother." Ezra looked at the tunnel, at the careful work. "Eric would be proud of what you have built here." Torvald was silent. Then he stepped aside. "Come in," he said. "It is cold out there." Ezra walked through the narrowed entrance, past the canvas curtain, into the first stope, and he stopped. The chamber had been transformed from a raw mining space into a home. The walls were lined with salvaged planks. Copper hooks held bundles of dried herbs. A fire burned in a pit at the back, the smoke rising and vanishing into a crack in the ceiling. A sleeping platform stood at one end, covered with blankets and furs. A table and stool sat near the center. And sitting at the table, with a leather journal open in front of her and a copper bracelet gleaming on her wrist, was a girl watching him with gray eyes exactly like her brother's. "You are the Svensson children," Ezra said. "Yes," Torvald said. "Your aunt told everyone you went to Denver." "She lied." Ezra turned slowly, taking in the details. The copper hooks, the dried herbs, the second stope visible through a crosscut, where a thin line of daylight fell through a crack in the rock. "How long?" he asked. "Almost 3 years." "Alone?" "Yes." Ezra walked to the fire and held out his hands to warm them. "Your father told me about this place," he said finally. "He worked here for 3 years. He said if he ever needed a place to disappear, this is where he would come." "He told me the same thing," Torvald said. "He was a good man, the best I ever knew." Ezra turned to face them. "My name is Ezra Boone. I will not tell anyone where you are, and if you need anything from town, I will bring it." The girl spoke for the first time. "Why?" Ezra looked at her. Her eyes had seen things that children should not see, and they had hardened in ways that children's eyes should not harden. "Because I know what it is to have nowhere else to go," he said. "And because your father was my friend, and because the world has enough cruelty without me adding to it." He stayed for coffee. He looked at the copper work in the storage system. He listened as Torvald explained the heating system and the ventilation. And when he left, he shook Torvald's hand and said, "You have built something remarkable here." Then he walked down the mountain, but he came back, every 2 weeks like Lindqvist. He brought supplies and took copper goods to sell in Montrose, 40 miles away, where no one would connect them to the children who had disappeared. And he kept their secret. But word had begun to spread. Not word about where the Svensson children were, but word about the strange things happening on Ironback Mountain. Smoke from a closed mine, a door in a collapsed tunnel, a young man who appeared at Lindqvist's ranch with copper goods that no one could explain. And people in Copper Falls had opinions. Marcus Dalloway was the first to come looking. He was 55 years old, a miner who had worked the mountains of Colorado for 30 years. When he heard the rumors about smoke on Ironback Mountain, he decided to see for himself. He rode up the old mine road on a morning in late spring of 1887, 1 year after the Svensson children had arrived. He found the entrance to the lowest tunnel, saw the door, and knocked. Torvald opened it. Marcus looked at him. He looked at the door. He looked at the timbers framing the entrance. And then he laughed. "2 children building their own grave in a mountain," he said. "That is what this is. A grave with a door on it." He shook his head. "Boy, I have been mining for 30 years. I have seen men die in tunnels just like this one. You do not know what you are doing, and when winter comes, this mountain will kill you." Torvald said nothing. "Come down to town," Marcus said. "I will talk to the sheriff. We will find somewhere for you to live. This is not safe." "Thank you for visiting," Torvald said. He closed the door. Marcus rode back to town and told everyone what he had seen. 2 children living in a hole in the mountain. The whole thing was madness, he said. Someone should do something. No one did anything. But they talked and they came. Franklin Osgood came next, a retired mining engineer who considered himself an expert. Structurally unsound, he told everyone who would listen. The timber framing is amateur work. The whole thing will collapse in the first heavy snow. Father Cornelius Walsh came in the summer with his Bible and a basket of food. God did not intend for his children to live underground like animals, he said. We pray in our own way, Torvald said. Thank you for visiting. He closed the door. Derek Simmons came with his friends, a group of young men who pounded on the door and shouted insults until Copper started barking. $5 says they do not make it to December, Derek told his friends on the way back down. Margaret Blackwood came with a basket of charity, wearing her finest dress. Poor things, she told the ladies of her sewing circle afterward. Their minds are not right. And Edna Partridge told the story to anyone who would listen. 2 orphans living in a mine, she said. Mark my words, something terrible is going to happen to them. It is only a matter of time. The people of Copper Falls listened and shook their heads and agreed that it was a shame. No one did anything. And in the tunnel on Ironback Mountain, Torval and Britta continued to build. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button right now. It is free, it takes a second, and it helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this. Now back to what happened next. By the spring of 1890, 4 years after they had walked into the mine, the Svensson home had grown into something remarkable. They had opened a 3rd chamber above the 2nd, accessed by a ladder through a narrow raise. This chamber had the crack that Torvald had widened, and the daylight that came through fell on wooden beds filled with soil, where Britta grew lettuce and herbs through the winter. She had lined the beds with polished copper sheets that reflected the light, spreading it across the growing plants like 100 small mirrors. A garden growing underground, fed by a thin column of sun. Torvald had built a hot water system, copper tubing coiled around the chimney pipe from the fire, heating creek water that flowed through by gravity. The hot water collected in a stone trough that served as both storage and bathing. They had running water in a cave in a mountain in 1890. The living quarters had been lined with split planks. Dried herbs hung from copper hooks. Copper ornaments caught the firelight and threw it around the chamber in moving points of amber and green. Outside, on the south-facing slope below the mine entrance, Britta had created a garden that produced food from May through October. Potatoes and beans and turnips and onions, planted in soil that she had cleared of rocks one by one. 3 hens lived in a pen against the south face of the mountain, the stone wall behind them radiating the day's warmth through the night. And the copper business had grown. Torvald made jewelry now, bracelets and pendants that Ezra sold in Montrose and Denver. He made decorative pieces, copper bowls, and picture frames that wealthy families bought as curiosities. They were not just surviving anymore. They were prospering. But Copper Falls had not forgotten them. The survey came in the spring of 1890. The county had hired a team to map mineral claims. When they reached Ironback Mountain, they found a door where no door should be. They noted the finding in their report. The report made its way to the county clerk. The county clerk told the sheriff. And the sheriff, a man named Marcus Webb, who had known the Svensson children's parents, decided to see for himself. He rode up the mountain on a May morning with 2 deputies. The door opened before he could knock. Torvald stood in the entrance. 22 years old now. His sister stood behind him, 17, with a copper bracelet on her wrist. And behind them both, visible through the canvas curtain, was a home. Sheriff Webb looked at the copper hooks and the dried herbs, and the firelight reflecting off polished metal. He looked at the 2 children who had disappeared 4 years earlier, and who were standing before him, alive and healthy, and not at all interested in being rescued. Your aunt says you went to Denver, he said. She lied, Torvald said. I know. Silence. Are you here to arrest us? Britta asked. For what? Living in an abandoned mine? Sheriff Webb shook his head. No. I am here because your aunt has been asking questions. She has heard the rumors. She might want you back. We are not going back. I know. Webb looked around one more time. Your father was a good man. He would be proud of what you have built here. I will tell your aunt I found nothing. He turned and walked back down the mountain. But Meredith found out anyway. She came 3 weeks later. She did not come alone. She came with Silas, who had spent 4 years nursing a grudge that had only grown sharper with time. They rode up the mountain on a June morning, Meredith in a dress that was too fine for the rough road, Silas in his best suit. Torvald saw them coming. He had time to close the door, time to pretend no one was home. He did not close the door. He stood in the entrance and waited. Meredith dismounted awkwardly. Silas stayed on his horse, looking down at Torvald with an expression that was half contempt and half fear. "Torvald," Meredith said, "and Britta, you are alive." "Yes. We have been so worried. We want you to come home." "No. Please, the house is empty without you. We made mistakes. We were wrong to put you out." Britta stepped forward, standing beside her brother. "We are family," she said. "Torvald and I, and Copper. That is our family." She gestured at the tunnel behind them. "And this is our home." "A hole in a mountain is not a home," Silas said. Torvald looked at him. 4 years of rage boiled behind his eyes, but his voice was calm. "A home is where you are safe," he said. "A home is where no one can hurt you. A home is where you belong." He paused. "We belong here. You are not welcome." Meredith's face crumpled. She looked like she might cry. "The town is talking," she said. "People think we are cruel. It makes us look bad." "Because you did throw us out with nothing," Britta said. "And you are cruel." "Britta." "No. You do not get to come here and pretend to be sorry. You threw us out because I would not be Silas's servant. You threw us out because Torvald defended me." Britta's voice was steady. Her eyes were not. "We have built a home. We have built a life. We do not need you. We do not want you. Go away." Meredith looked at Silas. Silas looked at Torvald. Something passed between the two men, something old and dangerous. Then Silas turned his horse and started back down the mountain. Meredith stood for a moment longer, looking at the children she had thrown away, looking at the home they had built. Then she mounted her horse and followed her husband. Torvald watched them go. When they were out of sight, Britta put her hand on his arm. "That is the last time," she said. "They will not come back." "I know." 4 years, she said. 4 years we have been here. And in all that time, not once did they come to see if we were alive. They only came when they heard we were doing well. "I know. Torvald," she turned to face him, "we are going to be okay." He looked at his sister. 17 years old, strong and smart and fierce in ways that their mother would have recognized. "Yes," he said, "we are." The winter of 1890 arrived early. The first snow fell on the 3rd of November. But the old-timers in Copper Falls looked at the sky and shook their heads. The geese had flown south 3 weeks earlier than usual. The rabbits' coats were thicker than anyone could remember. Ezra Boone came to the mine on the 15th of November with a mule loaded with extra supplies. "Something is coming," he said. "I can feel it in my bones. Stock up. Stay inside. Do not go down the mountain for any reason." Torvald looked at the sky. It was gray, the color of lead, and the air had a stillness to it that he had felt only once before, in Norway, when his father had taken him to visit relatives, and they had been caught in a storm that killed 6 people. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough that I am going to hole up in my cabin and not come out until spring." Torvald spent the next 2 weeks preparing. He cut firewood until his arms ached. He hauled water in barrels and stored it in the second stove. He checked the door hinges and the canvas curtains and the ventilation system. Britta helped. She organized the stores and made lists of everything they had. She reinforced the chicken pen. She brought the hens inside the tunnel entrance. And Copper, who was 5 years old now, paced the tunnel and whined and refused to go outside. Animals knew. The storm hit on the 12th of January, 1891. It did not announce itself with wind or snow. It announced itself with silence. The forest went quiet. The birds stopped singing. The creek slowed and then stopped as the cold intensified. And then the temperature dropped. At noon on the 12th, it was 20 degrees above zero. By 6 in the evening, it was 10 below. By midnight, it was 30 below. And it kept falling. Torvald had never felt cold like this. It was not the cold of a winter night that made you hurry to get inside. It was a cold that felt personal, that seemed to be reaching for you. that made every breath feel like swallowing broken glass. The wind came at 3 in the morning. It hit the mountainside like a fist, a sustained blast of 60 miles per hour that drove the snow horizontally through the trees. The sound was not a howl, it was a roar. Inside the mountain, Torvald and Britta felt the roar as a vibration in the rock around them. The temperature inside the stope did not change. It was 54 degrees as it always was, as it had been for millions of years. They sat by the fire with copper between them and listened to the world outside try to kill everything in it. And they were safe. In Copper Falls, they were not safe. The cold found every gap in every house. By the second day of the storm, the temperature inside Marcus Dalloway's house had dropped to 40 degrees. By the third day, it was 30. The stove was burning at full capacity, and still the heat was not enough. On the morning of the fourth day, Marcus went to the woodpile. The woodpile was empty. He had started the winter with 4 cords of split oak, enough to last until March. But the storm had consumed wood at 3 times the normal rate, and the pile that should have lasted months had lasted days. He stood in the howling wind, looking at the snow-covered ground where his woodpile had been, and he felt the cold reaching for him. His wife Ruth was inside with their daughter Emma, a 7-year-old who had been running a fever for 2 days. Ruth was also pregnant, though she had not told anyone because the early months were always uncertain. The fever was getting worse. The house was getting colder, and Marcus Dalloway understood that he and his family were going to die. Unless. The thought came to him slowly, reluctantly. The mine, the tunnel, the children he had mocked for 4 years. He went back inside and told his wife to get dressed. He told her to dress Emma in every piece of clothing they had. "Where?" she asked. "Up the mountain." "In this storm?" "Marcus, we will die before we get there. We will die if we stay." The walk to Ironback Mountain was 2 miles. In normal weather, it would take 45 minutes. In this storm, with the wind at 60 miles per hour and the wind chill at 70 below zero, it took 3 hours. Marcus carried Emma on his back. Ruth walked behind him, holding on to his coat so she would not lose him in the whiteness. They stopped every 100 yards to catch their breath. Marcus's fingers went numb in the first hour. He knew the numbness was a bad sign, that the tissue was freezing, but he kept walking. Ruth fell 3 times. Each time Marcus stopped and helped her up. Each time she was slower to rise. Emma did not speak. She had stopped speaking 2 hours into the walk, her face buried in her father's collar. They reached the mine road at noon. They followed the grade of the slope, climbing blind, trusting memory. And then, through the white blur of the storm, Marcus saw the door. The door that he had called a joke. The door that led to a grave. The door that was, at this moment, the only thing standing between his family and death. He knocked. He did not have the strength to knock hard. His frozen hands barely made a sound on the planks, but he knocked, and he waited, and he prayed. The door opened. Torvald Svensson stood in the entrance, 23 years old, wearing a wool shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Behind him, the tunnel was warm. Marcus could feel the heat reaching for him. Torvald looked at Marcus. He looked at Ruth. He looked at the small shape on Marcus's back, the child who was not moving. He stepped aside. "Come in," he said. They were not the last. Over the next 5 days, as the storm continued to rage, others came to the door on Ironback Mountain. Franklin Osgood and his wife arrived on the 4th day. Their house had caught fire from stove ashes, and they had been forced to flee into the storm. Derek Simmons came on the 6th day. He was alone. His house had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Father Cornelius Walsh came with his wife and 3 children on the 7th day. The church had lost a wall. Edna Partridge came on the 8th day with her 3 children. Her husband had gone out for firewood on the 2nd day and had not come back. 17 people in all crowded into the 3 stopes that Torvald and Britta had carved from the mountain. 17 people who had mocked and pitied and dismissed them. 17 people who were alive because 2 orphans had built a home in a hole in a mountain. On the 7th night, something unexpected happened. Ruth Dalloway had been pregnant. She had not told anyone, not even Marcus, because she had not been certain. But now, in the warmth of the mountain, with the storm raging outside and 17 people crowded into the stopes, her body decided it was time. Britta was the one who realized what was happening. She had been checking on the families, making sure everyone had enough blankets when she saw Ruth's face. The way she was breathing, the way her hands were pressed against her belly. "How long?" Britta asked quietly. "Since this morning," Ruth whispered. "I did not want to say anything. I did not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden," Britta said. "You are about to give us the first good news we have had in a week." She called for Torvald to boil water. She called for clean cloth. She remembered everything her mother had written in the journal about childbirth. The baby came at 3 in the morning, while the wind howled outside and the temperature dropped to 50 below, and the world did everything it could to end life. Inside the mountain, at 54 degrees, a new life began. It was a girl, small and red-faced and furious at being born into such a world, but alive, perfectly, impossibly alive. Marcus held his daughter for the first time in the glow of the firelight, with copper ornaments casting amber reflections on the walls, and 17 people watching in silence. "What will you name her?" Father Walsh asked. Marcus looked at Torvald, at Britta, at the home they had built in a hole in a mountain, the home that had saved his family twice now. "Hope," he said. "Her name is Hope." The baby cried once, then settled against her father's chest and closed her eyes. And in that moment, in that stope carved from rock by 2 orphan children, surrounded by the people who had mocked them, something shifted. The storm was still raging. The world outside was still trying to kill them. But inside the mountain a child had been born, and the child's name was Hope. And sometimes that is all you need. The storm lasted 9 days. On the morning of the 10th day, the wind stopped. The snow stopped. The sun came out for the first time in almost 2 weeks, and the people inside the mountain walked to the entrance and looked out at a world that had been transformed. The snow was 8 feet deep in the drifts. The trees were coated in ice, and the town of Copper Falls was in ruins. From the entrance of the mine, you could see the valley below, see the roofs that had collapsed and the walls that had caved in. The church steeple was still standing, but the building beneath it was damaged. The general store, Silas Hawthorne's store, had lost its front wall. Over the next few days, as the survivors made their way down the mountain and began to assess the damage, the full scale of the disaster became clear. 67 people had died in 4 counties. 40% of the livestock had frozen to death. 12 houses had collapsed completely. The Svensson home inside the mountain was untouched. On the 3rd day after the storm, Marcus Dalloway stood in the first stope. His hands were bandaged. He had lost 2 fingers to frostbite, the index and middle fingers of his left hand. His wife was sitting by the fire, holding baby Hope. Emma was beside her, petting Copper, who seemed to understand that the child needed comfort. Torvald was standing by the door, waiting. "I was wrong," Marcus said. The words came hard. He was not a man who admitted to being wrong. "I called you fools. I called this place a grave. I told everyone you would die up here, and the whole time you were building the only thing that could save us." Torvald said nothing. "4 years," Marcus continued. "4 years I laughed at you. And when I needed help, when my family was dying, you opened the door." He paused. "Why? I deserved to freeze out there. Why did you let me in?" Torvald was silent for a long moment. "Because my father taught me that a home is not a place where you keep people out," he said. "A home is a place where you keep people safe." Marcus bowed his head. "I am sorry," he said. "I am more sorry than I know how to say." "I know. Is there anything I can do?" Torvald looked at him, at the bandaged hands, at the wife and baby by the fire. "Yes," he said. "Learn. Build your own shelter, not like your old house. Like this. Thick walls, small openings, a way to hold heat, and when the next storm comes, be ready." Marcus nodded. "And teach others," Torvald added. "What you learn, what you build. Teach your neighbors. Teach everyone who will listen, because this storm will not be the last." "I will," Marcus said. "I swear to God I will." The others came to Torvald one by one. Franklin Osgood, the engineer who had called the structure unsound, admitted that he had been wrong about everything. "This is the most efficient shelter I have ever seen," he said. "Your father must have been a brilliant man." "He was," Torvald said, "and his father before him. 200 years of knowledge, passed down through generations. I just remembered what they taught me." Father Walsh apologized for saying that God did not want people to live underground. I was wrong, he said. God put the knowledge in human hearts, the knowledge to survive, the knowledge to build. And you use that knowledge. That is God's work, whether it happens in a church or in a mountain. Derek Simmons, who had bet $5 that they would not survive, did not apologize. He was too embarrassed. But he helped Torvald repair a damaged section of the tunnel entrance, working in silence. It was enough. Edna Partridge, who had told everyone in town that the Svensson children had lost their minds, sat with Britta and wept. I said such terrible things about you, she said, and you saved my children. You saved my children's lives. Britta took her hand. Your husband, she said. Do you know what happened to him? Edna shook her head. He went out for firewood on the second day. He never came back. When the snow melts, we will look for him. They found him in March when the drifts finally receded. He had made it to the woodpile and was loading his arms when the cold took him. He had died standing up, frozen in place, his arms still full of the wood that would have kept his family alive. They buried him in the cemetery on the hill, next to the graves of Eric and Ingrid Svensson. Stop here for a moment. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the conclusion. And tell us in the comments, what would you have felt standing at that door, asking to be let in by the children you had laughed at? Now let us see how the story ends. Spring came late that year, the snow lingering into May. But when it came, it brought changes. 8 families came to Torvald that summer, asking him to teach them how to build. He taught them. He showed them how to dig into a hillside, how to reinforce the walls, how to create ventilation that would let smoke escape without losing heat. He did not charge them. Knowledge should be free, he said. My father taught me everything I know. I am just passing it along. Among the students was Clara Brennan, the 19-year-old daughter of the town doctor. She came every week, asking questions that no one else thought to ask. Why this angle for the entrance, she would say. Why this depth for the fire pit? Why copper instead of iron? Torvald answered every question. He had learned from a father who believed that questions were the beginning of knowledge, and he taught the same way. Clara became his most dedicated student. By the end of that first year, she had helped design 3 new earth-sheltered homes. By the end of the decade, she had married one of Torvald's apprentices and built her own home into the hillside north of town. You taught me that survival is not luck, she told Torvald once. Survival is preparation, and preparation is knowledge. By the fall of 1891, 5 new earth-sheltered homes had been built in the hills around Copper Falls. By the winter of 1892, there were 10. By the end of the decade, there were 23. The copper business grew. Torvald's work was known throughout Colorado, and orders came from as far away as Denver and Santa Fe. He hired 2 young men from town to help with the heavy work. They were wealthy, not rich, not like the mining barons in Denver, but wealthy enough to want for nothing, wealthy enough to give generously, wealthy enough to help others the way they had once needed help themselves. By 1896, 10 years after they had walked into the mine, Torvald was 28 years old and Britta was 23. The home inside the mountain had grown into something that visitors called a marvel. 5 chambers now, connected by crosscuts and raises, lined with split planks and decorated with copper ornaments. Running water from the hot spring system, a library of 37 books, a workshop where 2 apprentices learned the copper trade. The Denver Post had sent a reporter that summer. He had expected to find 2 eccentric hermits living in squalor. Instead, he found what he later described as the most remarkable home I have ever entered, built by the most remarkable people I have ever met. The story ran on the front page under the headline, The Children in the Mountain. Hope Dalloway, now 5 years old, came to visit every Sunday with her father. She called Britta Aunt Bree and Torvald Uncle Thor, and spent hours playing with the children of the families who had moved into the earth-sheltered homes nearby. Marcus Dalloway had become Torvald's most devoted student. He had rebuilt his own home into the hillside, using every technique Torvald had taught him, and he had taught 5 other families to do the same. The man who had once called the mine a grave with a door now called it the school that saved my life. The years passed. In 1893, Meredith Hawthorne died of influenza. Silas had died 2 years earlier. of a heart attack that struck him down in the middle of his store. They were buried in unmarked graves on the outskirts of Copper Falls, and no one came to mourn them. Torvald did not attend either funeral. Neither did Britta. In the summer of 1900, 14 years after a limping dog had followed two children up a mountain road, Copper died. He was 14 years old, ancient for a dog. He had spent his last years sleeping by the fire in the first stope, too old to climb the mountain roads, too tired to do much more than wag his tail when someone he loved came near. He died in his sleep on a warm night in July, with his head resting on Britta's lap. They buried him outside the tunnel entrance, in a grave that Torvald carved from the rock. The headstone was copper, shaped like a bone, with words etched into the metal. Copper, the first member of our family. When we had nothing else, Britta cried for 3 days. Then she went back to work, because that was what you did. You mourned, and then you continued. You honored the dead by living. In 1900, a reporter from the Denver Post came to write a new story about the Svensson children who were no longer children. He found Torvald, 32 years old now, in the workshop he had built beside the mine entrance. Britta, 27, was in the second stope, teaching a group of children how to identify medicinal herbs. The reporter stayed for 3 days. He toured the mines and the workshops and the gardens. He interviewed the townspeople and recorded their memories. The story ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. It told the whole story: the death of the parents, the cruel aunt, the exile into the wilderness, the years of building and surviving, the storm that almost destroyed the town, the lives that were saved, the baby named Hope. And it ended with a quote from Britta, written in her mother's journal on the night she and Torvald had arrived at the mine, 14 years earlier. Day 1. We are here. The tunnel is dry. Torvald says we can live here. And they did, the reporter concluded. They lived, and they built, and they saved. And in the end, the children who had nothing gave more to their community than anyone who had everything. In 1978, 88 years after Torvald and Britta first walked into the mine, a team of researchers from the Colorado School of Mines came to Ironback Mountain. They were studying earth-sheltered construction, looking for historical examples of passive heating and cooling techniques. They had heard about the Svensson homes. They expected to find ruins. Instead, they found a structure that was still intact, still functional, still maintaining a constant temperature of 54 degrees Fahrenheit in every season. The researchers spent 3 months measuring and documenting. They found that Torvald had, without any formal training, applied principles of thermal mass and passive ventilation that modern engineers were only beginning to understand. Professor James Holloway, who led the research team, wrote in his final report, Torvald Svensson, at the age of 18, with no education beyond what his father had taught him, constructed a dwelling that is more thermally efficient than 90% of the homes built in America in 1890. He did not do this because he was smarter than the engineers of his time. He did it because he listened to his father, and his father listened to his grandfather, and his grandfather listened to the mountain. There is knowledge and tradition that we are only now beginning to rediscover. The Svensson mine was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1982. It is still there today. Torvald Svensson died in 1939 at the age of 71. He died in the first stope, in the bed he had built 53 years earlier, surrounded by his children and grandchildren and the copper ornaments that caught the firelight. His last words were to his daughter, a woman named Ingrid after his mother. Tell them to keep building. Tell them to keep learning. Tell them that the old ways are not old. They are just waiting to be remembered. Britta lived until 1943. She was 78 years old, the wealthiest woman in the county, and the most generous. She had funded schools and hospitals and scholarships. She had taught 3 generations of children how to find food in the forest and medicine in the meadow. The last entry in the last journal, written the day before she died, said, "They said we were crazy when we walked into the mountain. They said we would die, but we did not die. We lived, and the silence we kept, the silence we chose, that was not silence at all. That was our answer." The mine on Ironback Mountain stands empty now. No one has lived there since Britta's death, though the County Historical Society maintains it and offers tours every summer. Visitors walk through the narrow entrance and feel the cool air wrap around them and stand in the first stop looking at the copper hooks and the fire pit and the sleeping platform where two children once huddled together for warmth. They read the plaque on the wall. Here in 1886, Torvald and Britta Svensson built a home from nothing and proved that what the world throws away is sometimes what others need to build a life. They walk outside and stand at Copper's grave, touching the copper bone that marks the resting place of a dog who joined two children on the worst day of their lives and stayed with them until the end of his. They look down at the valley where Copper Falls still stands, now a town of 3,000 people, many of them living in earth-sheltered homes that their great-grandparents learned to build from two orphans who had nowhere else to go. And they think about what it means to survive, not just to live, to survive, to take what the world gives you, even when what the world gives you is nothing, and to build something from it, something that lasts, something that matters, something that saves lives. The Svensson children had nothing when they walked into that mine in September of 1886. They had no money, no tools, no food, no shelter. They had each other. They had a dog who would not leave them. They had the knowledge their parents had given them, passed down through generations. And they had something else, something that cannot be taught or bought or stolen. They had the refusal to give up. That refusal built a home. That refusal saved 17 lives. That refusal brought a baby named Hope into the world in the middle of a storm that was trying to end everything. That refusal created a legacy that has lasted more than 100 years and will last 100 more. And the mine that the Consolidated Copper Company abandoned because the copper was not worth the cost of extraction turned out to contain exactly enough copper for two children with a forge and a stone anvil and 10 years of firelight and patience. Not more, not less. Just enough to prove that what people throw away is sometimes what others need to build an entire life. Thank you for listening to this story. If it reminded you that sometimes the people who disappear are the ones who finally found where they belong, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories from the American frontier, and tell us in the comments, what would you have built in that mountain? The Svensson children built a home. What will you build? The end.